She wasn't supposed to be on that westbound train. Hidden beneath her runaway sister's heavy lace veil, Abigail gripped a stolen ticket, hurtling toward a ruthless frontier. But the man waiting at the platform wasn't the wealthy rancher they were promised. He was a rugged, dangerous beast of the mountains. The morning of the 14th of April, 1881, broke with a bitter, damp chill over St. Louis, Missouri, mirroring the cold panic gripping Abigail Sterling's chest. The Sterling family home, a crumbling brick estate on the corner of Lafayette Avenue, was quiet, save for the rhythmic, desperate ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor. On the mahogany table lay a crumpled note, smelling faintly of cheap rosewater and betrayal. "I cannot do it, Abby. I cannot marry a man I have only seen in a tin-type photograph, living in the dirt of Wyoming. Bartholomew Finch has asked for my hand, and we are boarding a steamboat for New Orleans. Forgive me, Clara." Abigail read the words until they blurred. Clara. Beautiful, golden-haired, utterly selfish Clara. For 6 months, their lives had revolved around the salvation Clara's impending marriage was supposed to bring. Their late father, Thomas Sterling, had died, leaving them drowning in a sea of promissory notes. The bank was poised to seize the house, throwing Abigail and their frail, bedridden mother into the street. Then came the correspondence from Mr. Harrison Montgomery, a reportedly wealthy cattle baron from Cheyenne, Wyoming. He had written to their parish priest, seeking a bride of good breeding. Clara's portrait was sent. Montgomery paid off the Sterling family's immediate debts as a dowry and sent a first-class ticket on the Union Pacific Railroad. And now, Clara was gone. Abigail looked at her own reflection in the hallway mirror. Where Clara was a vision of porcelain skin and spun gold, Abigail was entirely practical. She possessed dark, unruly hair, a smattering of freckles across a sun-kissed nose, and hands calloused from years of tending the garden and keeping the house afloat while her sister practiced the pianoforte. She was 24, a spinster by societal standards, entirely unsuitable for a wealthy cattle baron who had purchased a trophy wife. But the bank manager, Mr. Josiah Higgins, was due at noon. If the ticket was not used, if the contract was broken, Montgomery's lawyers would demand the dowry back, the house would be gone, her mother would be destitute. The decision was not made out of bravery, but out of sheer, suffocating necessity. Abigail marched up the stairs and opened Clara's cedar trunk. She pulled out the expensive traveling gown of navy blue silk, tailored perfectly for her sister's slender frame. It pinched Abigail's ribs, a physical reminder of the lie she was wearing. She took Clara's wide-brimmed mourning hat purchased for their father's funeral and lowered the thick, black lace veil over her face. It obscured her features completely. She packed only the absolute necessities: 2 woolen dresses, her father's pocket watch, a heavy hunting knife she had hidden in the cellar, and the leather-bound contract bearing Clara's forged signature. The train depot was a chaotic symphony of hissing steam, shouting porters, and clanking iron. Abigail navigated the platform with her head bowed, clutching her small valise. When the conductor asked for her ticket, her voice trembled beneath the veil. "Miss Clara Sterling," she whispered, handing over the heavy cardstock. "Boarding car number 4, miss." The conductor tipped his hat, completely unaware that he was sealing her fate. The journey west was a grueling endurance test that stripped away any lingering illusions of a romantic adventure. For 4 days and 3 nights, the Union Pacific locomotive tore through the landscape, a mechanical beast belching black coal smoke into the endless prairie sky. Inside the passenger car, the plush velvet seats quickly became stifling. Abigail kept to herself, rarely lifting her veil. When she did, it was only to eat meager portions of dried biscuits and stare out the window. The rolling green hills of Missouri gave way to the flat, desolate plains of Nebraska. The world outside grew increasingly harsh, bleached by the sun and scoured by the wind. She shared her section with an overly talkative traveling salesman named Thaddeus Miller and a quiet, stern-faced woman, Mrs. Agatha Reed, who clutched a Bible as if it were a life preserver. "Heading to the territory, are you?" Miller asked on the 3rd day, eyeing her veil with undisguised curiosity. "You don't look dressed for the dust, ma'am. Cheyenne is a hard place." full of gamblers, rustlers, and men who ain't seen a woman in a decade. I am meeting my fiancé, Abigail replied stiffly, trying to sound like the haughty aristocrat Clara was, Mr. Harrison Montgomery. Mrs. Reed's head snapped up. She traded a quick, unreadable glance with the salesman. Montgomery? Mrs. Reed echoed, her voice dropping an octave. The man who owns the Silver Spur? I believe so, Abigail said, her heart accelerating. Do you know of him? Miller coughed, suddenly very interested in the dust on his boots. Oh, everyone knows Harrison Montgomery. Wealthy man. Very ambitious. The abrupt silence in the carriage sent a cold spike of dread down Abigail's spine. They were hiding something. She spent the final night of the journey wide awake, listening to the rhythmic, hypnotic clacking of the wheels against the iron rails, praying to a God she hoped was listening out here in the emptiness. She was riding toward a stranger, wearing a dead sister's clothes, metaphorically speaking, and stepping into a life built entirely on a foundation of desperate lies. Cheyenne, Wyoming, did not look like the promise of salvation. It looked like an open wound on the prairie. When the train finally screeched to a halt, the air that poured into the cabin was thick with the smell of horse manure, whiskey, and raw pine. Abigail stepped onto the wooden platform, the Wyoming wind immediately tearing at her heavy skirts and threatening to rip the hat from her head. She gripped the veil, holding it down as she claimed her single trunk. The platform was a sea of rough-hewn men in canvas trousers and dusty Stetson hats. There were no tailored suits, no polished carriages. She stood near a wooden post, the sun beating down mercilessly, waiting for the wealthy cattle baron who had purchased her sister. 1 hour passed. Then 2. The crowd thinned, leaving only a few loiterers and a station master sweeping the boards. Abigail's legs began to tremble. Had Montgomery realized the deception before she even arrived? Had he abandoned the contract? If she was stranded here, penniless and alone, she would not survive the week. Just as despair threatened to choke her, a shadow fell over her. She turned, and her breath hitched in her throat. The man standing before her was not Harrison Montgomery. The tintype photograph had shown a slender, clean-shaven man with a parted mustache and a neat cravat. The giant looming over her was wildness incarnate. He stood well over 6 feet, his shoulders broad enough to block out the late afternoon sun. He wore a coat made of heavy, scraped bison hide, the collar lined with thick, coarse fur. A wide-brimmed felt hat, stained with sweat and the elements, shadowed his face, but beneath it she could see a thick, untamed dark beard and eyes, the color of a winter storm, a piercing, icy gray. A massive hunting knife was strapped to his thigh, and a Winchester rifle rested effortlessly in the crook of his arm. He smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and danger. You, the Sterling woman? His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like boulders shifting deep underground. Abigail took a step back, her back pressing against the wooden post. I am waiting for Mr. Harrison Montgomery. I am his fiancé. The giant let out a short, humorless scoff. He reached into his heavy leather satchel and pulled out a familiar roll of parchment. It was the marriage contract, the very one bearing Clara's forged signature and the seal of the St. Louis Bank. Montgomery ain't coming, the man said, his storm-gray eyes locked onto the black lace of her veil. Is he delayed? She asked, her voice wavering despite her best efforts. He's dead, the man stated bluntly, showing absolutely no emotion. Caught a bullet between the eyes 3 nights ago at the Golden Nugget Saloon. Cheated at a game of faro against a man who didn't take kindly to it. Abigail's knees gave out. She grabbed the post to keep from collapsing. Dead? The man who was supposed to save her family, the man she had sacrificed her identity for, was dead? The money? The dowry? The house? It was all gone. She was trapped thousands of miles from home with a dead man's debt. Then what is to become of me? She whispered, the panic finally breaking through her stoic facade. Why do you have my contract? The mountain man stepped closer. The sheer size of him was suffocating, yet oddly, he did not exude malice, just a brutal, uncompromising reality. Name's Jeremiah Boone, he said. Montgomery owed me for a winter's worth of pelts, $3,000 worth. When he died, the town marshal liquidated his assets to pay his debts. Turns out, the Silver Spur Ranch was a sham. The man owned nothing but the clothes on his back and a mountain of gambling markers. Jeremiah tapped the rolled parchment against his gloved palm. The only thing of value he had was this contract. The bank draft attached to it cleared yesterday. So, the marshal signed the contract over to me to settle the debt. Abigail stared at him through the veil, horror creeping up her throat. You? You claimed a human being to settle a debt for animal skins? I claimed a working contract, Jeremiah corrected gruffly. I live a 4-day ride up into the Wind River Range. Winter is coming early. I need a woman to keep the cabin, salt the meat, and tend the fires while I run the trap lines. Montgomery bought a bride. I bought a survivor. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand hovering near her face. But I don't need a fragile, weeping Southern belle who's gonna die of the fever by November. Let's see what I bought. Before Abigail could stop him, Jeremiah hooked a finger under the edge of her heavy black veil and flipped it back over her hat. The harsh Wyoming sunlight hit Abigail's face. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, bracing for the inevitable. She knew what he expected. He held the tintype of Clara. He expected an angel with golden hair and skin like milk. She opened her eyes, fixing him with a defiant, terrified glare. Her dark hair was wind-blown and escaping its pins. Her face was pale from the journey, her features sharp and practical, completely lacking Clara's soft, aristocratic beauty. Jeremiah Boone went perfectly still. His icy gray eyes flicked from her face to the photograph he pulled from his pocket and back to her. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy. Abigail lifted her chin, refusing to cry. I know, she said, her voice finding a sudden, desperate strength. I am not the woman in the picture. I am not Clara. I am Abigail, her sister. Clara ran away, and my family was going to be thrown into the street. I took her place. I lied. If you wish to send me to the marshal and have me arrested for fraud, do it now and be done with it. Jeremiah didn't move. His gaze dropped from her face to her hands. He noticed she wasn't wearing silk gloves. He saw the calluses on her palms, the faint scar across her left thumb from a kitchen knife, the way her grip on the heavy wooden trunk was white-knuckled but steady. He saw the fierce, unyielding survival instinct burning in her dark eyes. He slowly folded the tintype photograph of the beautiful Clara and shoved it into his pocket, dismissing it entirely. You ain't the girl in the picture, Jeremiah rasped, the corners of his mouth twitching into what might have been the ghost of a smile. I am not, Abigail agreed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Jeremiah reached down, grabbed the thick leather handle of her massive trunk, and heaved it onto his shoulder as if it weighed no more than a feather pillow. He turned his head and looked at her, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning with a strange, sudden intensity. Good, the mountain man said. She wouldn't have survived the first freeze. Grab your bag, Abigail. I'll take you. The journey into the Wind River Range was a brutal initiation into Abigail's new reality. She rode a sturdy, sure-footed mare named Nellie, trailing behind Jeremiah Boone's massive roan stallion. The incline was steep, the terrain unforgiving, and the air grew thinner and sharper with every passing mile. The golden plains of Cheyenne quickly gave way to jagged granite spires and dense forests of lodgepole pine. For 3 days, they barely spoke. Jeremiah rode with a quiet, lethal vigilance, his Winchester rifle always resting across his saddle pommel. He pushed a grueling pace, clearly expecting her to complain, to weep, or to beg for rest. But Abigail set her jaw, clutching the reins with her blistered hands, and focused on the rhythmic swaying of the horse. She used her late father's pocket watch, tucked into her bodice, to track the agonizing hours. She would not break. On the evening of the 4th day, as a bitter frost began to settle over the pines, they arrived at the cabin. It sat in a secluded valley, a sturdy structure built of thick, hand-hewn logs, its roof pitched steep to shed the heavy winter snows. A small creek, already edged with ice, babbled nearby. Inside it was sparse but meticulously kept. There was a large stone hearth, a cast-iron stove, a heavy oak table, and a single bed covered in thick grizzly and wolf pelts. It smelled of wood smoke, dried sage, and the raw earth. "This is it," Jeremiah said, dropping her heavy trunk onto the rough planked floor. He turned to face her in the dim light of the cabin. "I leave before dawn to check the trap lines. I'm gone for 2, sometimes 3 days at a stretch. Your job is to keep the fire from dying. Chop the kindling and salt the meat I bring back. You let the fire die in January. You freeze. You let the meat rot. We starve. Understand?" "I understand," Abigail said, her voice steady, though her legs were shaking from exhaustion. The first month was an education in pure survival. Abigail learned the difference between green wood and seasoned wood. She learned how to skin a rabbit without ruining the meat, a task that made her violently ill the first time, though she forced herself to finish it while Jeremiah watched from the doorway, his storm-gray eyes unreadable. She scrubbed the floors, mended his torn canvas coats with a heavy needle, and baked hardtack biscuits that grew progressively less dense as the weeks went on. In return, Jeremiah provided. He brought back venison, elk, and pelts of beaver and fox. As the days shortened and the nights grew desperately cold, the oppressive silence between them began to shift into something resembling a quiet, mutual respect. In the evenings, while the wind howled like a wounded animal against the timber walls, they sat by the fire. Jeremiah would clean his rifle or sharpen his skinning knives, and Abigail would read from a battered copy of A Tale of Two Cities she had found on a dusty shelf. One night, as the fire popped and hissed, Jeremiah spoke without looking up from the whetstone. Montgomery was a fool, but he had a good eye. The woman in that picture was pretty enough to start a war. He paused, testing the blade against his thumb. But she wouldn't have lasted a week up here. Abigail looked up from her book, her heart giving a strange, sudden flutter. "And me?" Jeremiah finally met her gaze. The flickering firelight softened the harsh lines of his face, catching the silver flecks in his eyes. "You," he rumbled softly, "are the toughest goddamn thing I've ever seen in these mountains." It wasn't a declaration of love, but in the brutal wilderness of the Wyoming Territory, it was the highest praise a man could give. But the fragile peace they were building was about to be shattered by the sins of the dead man who had brought them together. The first true blizzard of the season hit on November 12th, burying the valley in 3 feet of powder. Jeremiah had left 2 days prior to check the northernmost traps along the ridges of the Shoshone National Forest. He was overdue. Abigail was at the woodpile, her breath pluming in the freezing air as she swung the heavy iron axe when she heard the crunch of hooves. She froze. Jeremiah's roan stallion had a distinct, heavy tread. This was lighter, and there were 3 of them. Through the veil of falling snow, 3 riders emerged from the tree line. They were bundled in heavy dusters, their faces obscured by scarves and low-pulled hats. Abigail's blood ran cold. No friendly traveler came this far up the mountain in November. Dropping the axe, she bolted for the cabin door. She slammed it shut and threw the heavy wooden crossbar into place just as the riders pulled up outside. "Open up, Boone!" a voice barked, harsh and nasal. "We know you're in there!" Abigail backed away from the door, her eyes darting to the corner where Jeremiah kept a spare shotgun. "Boone ain't here, Dutch," another voice muttered. "No smoke from the forge, just the house fire. Then the bride is—" "The first man," Dutch replied. Abigail recognized the name from whispers at the Cheyenne depot. Caleb Dutch Vander. He was a notorious enforcer for the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, a man who doubled as a violent debt collector for the underground gambling rings. A heavy boot kicked the door. The wood groaned. "Open the door, little lady," Dutch called out, his voice dripping with malice. "Harrison Montgomery owed my boss a whole lot of money, $3,000 worth. Word in town is, Montgomery's mail-order bride showed up the day he died, a rich girl from St. Louis. We know Montgomery didn't have the cash, which means he must have had you bring it as a dowry. Hand over the bank drafts, and we'll ride away." Abigail's breath hitched. They thought she had the money. They thought she was the wealthy Clara Sterling. "I don't have any money," Abigail shouted back, her voice remarkably steady. "There was no dowry. Montgomery lied to us too." "I ain't a patient man," Dutch snarled. The door shuddered violently under a synchronized assault. The iron brackets holding the crossbar screamed in protest. Abigail sprinted to the corner, grabbed the double-barreled shotgun, and fumbled with the heavy brass shells, her numb fingers slipping. Crack! The crossbar splintered. The door burst open, letting in a swirl of blinding white snow and 3 armed men. Abigail raised the shotgun, but the closest man, a burly thug with a scarred cheek, lunged forward and swatted the barrel aside. The gun discharged, blowing a hole in the roof. The recoil knocked Abigail to the floor. Dutch stepped into the cabin, pulling down his scarf to reveal a cruel, pockmarked face. He leveled a Colt revolver at her chest. "Tear the place apart," he ordered his men. "Check the floorboards. Check the girl's trunk." "There is nothing here!" Abigail screamed, scrambling backward until her spine hit the stone hearth. Her hand instinctively drifted to the folds of her heavy woolen skirt, where she kept the hunting knife she had brought from St. Louis. The thugs upended her trunk, scattering Clara's useless silk dresses and her father's watch across the floor. They smashed the crockery and ripped the pelts from the bed. "Nothing, Dutch," the scarred man grunted. Dutch's eyes darkened. He cocked the hammer of his revolver and stepped toward Abigail. "Maybe Montgomery told you where he buried his stash. Maybe I need to hurt you a little to jog your memory." He reached down to grab her hair. Before his fingers could make contact, a sound shattered the air, the deafening roar of a Winchester rifle. The scarred man at the trunk collapsed, a neat hole blown through his chest. Dutch spun around. Standing in the doorway, framed by the raging blizzard, was Jeremiah Boone. He looked like an avenging spirit of the mountain, covered in snow, his gray eyes blazing with a murderous, unholy fury. The second thug raised his pistol, but Jeremiah was impossibly fast for a man his size. He levered the Winchester and fired from the hip, catching the man in the shoulder and sending him spinning out into the snow. Dutch fired wildly. The bullet grazed Jeremiah's ribs, tearing through the heavy bison coat. Jeremiah didn't even flinch. He dropped the empty rifle, drew the massive knife from his thigh, and charged. The impact shook the cabin walls. Jeremiah tackled Dutch to the floor, the revolver skittering across the wood. The 2 men engaged in a brutal, desperate struggle, rolling through the shattered crockery. Dutch was smaller, but he was vicious, gouging at Jeremiah's eyes and clawing at the bullet wound on his ribs. Dutch managed to draw a hidden boot knife, thrusting it upward toward Jeremiah's throat. Jeremiah caught the man's wrist, his muscles straining, blood seeping through his coat. They were locked in a deadly stalemate. Abigail didn't think. She acted on the pure, unfiltered instinct she had honed over the last brutal month. She pulled her hunting knife from her skirt, lunged forward, and drove the blade deep into Dutch's thigh. Dutch screamed, his grip faltering. That split second was all Jeremiah needed. He wrenched the knife from Dutch's hand and delivered a single crushing blow to the man's temple with the heavy hilt of his own blade. Dutch went limp. The cabin fell dead silent, save for the howling wind outside and the ragged, heavy breathing of the 2 survivors. Jeremiah slowly pushed himself off the unconscious man. He clutched his bleeding side, his chest heaving. He looked down at Abigail. She was on her knees, her hands trembling, covered in Dutch's blood, her dark hair plastered to her sweat-sheened face. He didn't check his own wound. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his massive, bloodied hands gently gripping her shoulders. "Are you hurt, Abby? Did they touch you?" It was the first time he had ever called her Abby. "I'm unhurt," she gasped, dropping the knife and suddenly pulling him into a fierce, desperate embrace. She buried her face in his snow-covered coat, the smell of pine and gunpowder filling her senses. Jeremiah wrapped his arms around her, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, burying his face in her dark hair. "I saw the door broken," he whispered, his voice trembling the first time she had ever heard the mountain man sound afraid. "I thought I lost you." They tied Dutch and his surviving man up and dragged them to the lean-to shed, intending to turn them over to the federal marshals in the spring. That night, after Abigail had cleaned and stitched the graze on Jeremiah's ribs, they sat by the newly stoked fire. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a heavy, profound intimacy in its wake. Jeremiah stood up with a wince. He walked over to his satchel, pulled out the leather-bound marriage contract bearing Clara's forged signature, and walked back to the hearth. Without a word, he tossed it into the flames. Abigail watched the parchment curl and turned to black ash. "Why did you do that?" she asked softly. "That was your collateral. Your $3,000. Jeremiah knelt in front of her chair, looking up into her dark, resilient eyes. "You aren't a debt, Abigail. You never were. Not to me." He reached out, his rough thumb gently wiping a smudge of soot from her cheek. "The spring thaw comes in May. When the pass clears, I'll take you back to Cheyenne. I'll buy you a ticket back to St. Louis. You've earned your freedom 10 times over." Abigail looked at the ashes in the fire, then at the rugged, scarred face of the man who had bought her, tested her, and ultimately treated her with more honor than any civilized man she had ever met. She thought of St. Two, Louis, the stifling parlor, the endless anxiety over money. She had left as a desperate imposter. She had become something entirely different. She reached out and placed her hand over his, lacing her calloused fingers through his. "I don't want a ticket to St. Louis," Abigail said, a slow, genuine smile breaking across her face. "I am perfectly happy, exactly where I am. But I would like a proper ring, Jeremiah, and a preacher when the pass clears." Jeremiah Boone, the fierce mountain man who feared nothing on God's earth, let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a sob, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her as the winter storm